Have you ever thought about what someone feels when they know their time is up? What would you say if you had one last chance to speak? These are the stories of people who stood on the edge of life and death, fighting with the consequences of their actions. From their final meals to their last words, we're about to explore the raw moments of March 2025 before they met their fate. Jesse Dean Hoffman. On a cool night in New Orleans, November 26, 1996, a 28-year-old advertising executive named Molly Elliott was leaving work, probably thinking about dinner or a phone call she needed to return. Little did she know those were her very last moments. Out of the shadows stepped 18-year-old Jesse Dean Hoffman, and everything changed. He wasn't some petty thief looking for cash. He had a gun, a plan, and a sinister intent. He forced Molly to drive with him. At gunpoint, she withdrew cash from an ATM. But that wasn't enough. He took her to a remote area in St. Tammany Parish, a place far from the city's noise, but close enough to hear a scream, if anyone had been listening. That night, Jesse Hoffman SA'd Molly, then murdered her. The crime was brutal, the kind that shakes a city. That kind of horror doesn't get forgotten. By 1998, justice came in the form of a first-degree murder conviction and a death sentence. And then, silence. For decades, Hoffman sat on death row while Louisiana hit pause on executions. No one was killed by the state for over 15 years. Until now. March 18, 2025. The pause was over. Hoffman became the first prisoner in Louisiana's history to be executed by nitrogen hypoxia, a method so new, so untested, it's been described as an experiment disguised as punishment. Alabama had tried it a few times with disturbing results. Witnesses said inmates gasped, thrashed, and took minutes to die. Yet Louisiana followed suit. Hoffman's legal team begged the courts to reconsider. They argued this method violated the Eighth Amendment of cruel and unusual punishment, especially after what had been seen in Alabama. They said it violated his religious rights. They even won a last-minute stay from a district judge. But it didn't hold. The Fifth Circuit Court overturned it. Then the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in and denied his final appeal. By a 5-4 vote, the execution was greenlit. Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. was strapped into the chamber. Just the hiss of gas and a long, slow end. Louisiana's first execution in over a decade, and one of the most controversial in the country's recent history. Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. was born on September 1, 1978 in Louisiana, a state known for jazz, gumbo, and deep Southern roots. But for Jesse, life was anything but smooth. He was one of 5 siblings, and his childhood was marked more by survival than celebration. Home was no safe haven. According to his brother Marvin Fields, their mother was an abuser in every sense of the word. She didn't just yell, she tormented. When her children misbehaved, punishment came in the form of a thick belt cut into strips. Sometimes it went even further. She'd force their tiny hands onto a hot stove until blisters bubbled up. It was discipline turned into torture, and for Jesse, those scars, emotional and physical, never really healed. Still, despite the violence at home, Jesse tried. He wasn't always lost. At one point, he was thriving in school, playing quarterback for the football team, racking up straight A's through the 11th grade, a kid with promise, a kid who could have taken a very different road. But then life took a turn. He got into a relationship that seemed to derail his focus. His grades slipped, his priorities shifted, and slowly the hopeful young quarterback began to fade. After graduating from Kennedy High School, Jesse bounced around different jobs, working in restaurants, inns, anything that paid. By November 1996, he was parking cars in New Orleans as a valet. Less than 3 weeks into that job, he abducted, raped, and murdered Molly Elliott. It was as if all the rage, the pain, and the chaos of his past collided in one violent act. And it changed everything. Adding to the tragedy, not long after Jesse's conviction, his older brother Charles Fields was shot and killed in New Orleans at the age of 25. One family, two lives, both ended by violence, one as the victim, the other as the cause. Jesse never married, but during his time in jail, his girlfriend gave birth to their son. A child he would never raise. A child who would grow up with the shadow of his father's crime hanging overhead. Hoffman's life started in chaos and ended in controversy. Whether he was a product of his environment or something darker altogether, only one thing is certain. By the time the gas filled that chamber in March 2025, the boy who once threw perfect passes under Friday night lights was long gone. At 6:12 p.m., Hoffman was led into the execution chamber. No words, no final apology, no last-minute declaration of innocence or remorse. In fact, he declined to say anything at all. No final statement, just silence. He also refused a last meal. Whatever that meant, whether it was guilt, defiance, or sheer numbness, we'll never know. Unlike many others on death row who requested steaks, sodas, or comfort foods from childhood, Hoffman chose nothing. Not a bite, not a word. Prison officials fitted him with the mask that would deliver the nitrogen gas, and at 6:31 p.m. they began the procedure. Nitrogen filled the mask, cutting off his oxygen supply. It lasted for 19 minutes. Witnesses said it was relatively smooth, but one state official noted that Hoffman convulsed, his body jerking in sudden, involuntary spasms before going still. Those who've seen nitrogen executions before know painless is a promise that might not always hold true. At 6:50 p.m., Jesse Dean Hoffman was pronounced dead. His execution wasn't just another mark on the calendar. It was a moment of national attention. With that final breath, Louisiana rejoined the ranks of executing states after a long hiatus and became only the second state in America to carry out death by nitrogen hypoxia. Hoffman's execution kicked off a grim chain reaction. Over just 3 days, 4 men were executed across the U.S., a rare and intense burst of state-sanctioned death. But Jesse's case stood out, not just for its brutality or the science fiction-like method used to end his life, but because of how stark and stripped down it was. No final words, no last meal, no fight left. Just a man who once caused unthinkable pain, now fading from the world in near total silence, leaving behind a legacy of violence, controversy, and a method of execution that still raises more questions than answers. Brad Keith Sigmon. Before he became the first man in nearly 15 years to die by firing squad, Brad Keith Sigmon was just another face in the crowd, aging, quiet, nearly forgotten on death row. But long before the prison jumpsuit and shackles, Sigmon's name had already been scorched into South Carolina's memory for something unimaginably brutal. It was April of 2001. Sigmon had just gone through a bitter breakup with his girlfriend, a relationship that didn't end in yelling or slam doors. It ended in silence. And in that silence, something inside Brad began to boil. Exactly 1 week after the split, he snapped. Sigmon stormed into his ex-girlfriend's home in Greenville County, not to beg for a second chance, but to destroy. He wasn't after her, though. Instead, he targeted the people closest to her, her parents, David and Gladys Lark. In their late 50s and early 60s, they had no idea that opening the door to Sigmon that day would be a death sentence. Armed with nothing but a baseball bat, Brad Sigmon bludgeoned both of them to death in their own home. The attack was savage, relentless. It wasn't about money or self-defense. It was about rage. And it was personal. What followed was a manhunt, a conviction, and eventually a seat in South Carolina's death row. But even then, Sigmon would remain in the shadows for over 2 decades, until March of 2025, when his name once again hit headlines. Not just for the murders, but for how he chose to die. Brad Sigmon's story begins on November 12, 1957 in South Carolina. His mom, Virginia, was just 17 when she gave birth to him. The family life was far from normal. His dad, Ronnie, was a U.S. military man, which meant Brad and his siblings moved around a lot. From South Carolina to the Philippines, sometimes it felt like there was no stability, no place to call home. But the real chaos came from his parents' troubled relationship. His dad, a violent alcoholic, regularly beat his mom. Brad, the oldest, often tried to protect her from his father's rage. But despite the constant upheaval, there were moments of normalcy, school, friendships, even a job or two. Brad seemed to be on track, but underneath it all, trouble was brewing. By the age of 18, Brad found himself on the wrong side of the law for the first time, charged with armed robbery. That was just the beginning. Over the next few years, his criminal record grew, mostly filled with DUIs and domestic disputes. In the 90s, things took a darker turn. Sigmund survived a violent encounter when he was shot while breaking into his wife's house. He was lucky to live through that, but it didn't stop his spiral into even more destructive behavior. Fast forward to 2001. Brad's life was falling apart yet again. He'd just lost another relationship, this time with Rebecca Barbar, a woman he'd lived with for a few years. And as much as he tried to convince himself he could move on, it wasn't that simple. He became fixated on Rebecca, and when she moved in with her parents, David and Gladys Lark, in Taylor, South Carolina, something inside Brad snapped. He wasn't just heartbroken, he was obsessed, and this obsession would soon turn deadly. Brad Sigmund's obsession with his ex-girlfriend Rebecca Barber had spiraled out of control. They had been together for 3 years, but when Rebecca ended the relationship early in 2001, Sigmund couldn't let go. She moved in with her parents, David and Gladys Lark, in Taylor's, South Carolina, but that didn't stop Sigmund. Instead, it pushed him further into a dangerous obsession. He started stalking Rebecca, convinced she was seeing someone else. And all the while, he was desperate to get her back. On the night of April 26th of 2001, Sigmund and his friend Eugene Strube spent hours drinking and doing drugs. By the morning, Sigmund was fueled by extreme fits of rage. He confided in Strube about his twisted plan. When Rebecca left to take her kids to school, Sigmund would break into the Larks' home, tie them up, and then force Rebecca to come back to him. Strube was supposed to help, but he backed out at the last minute. April 27th came, and Sigmund made his move. He entered the Larks' home armed with a baseball bat, where he found 62-year-old David in the kitchen and 59-year-old Gladys in the living room. What followed was pure monstrosity. Sigmund savagely beat both of them with the bat, repeatedly striking their skulls until they were unrecognizable. 9 blows each. After killing them, Sigmund stole David's gun, waiting for Rebecca to return. When she finally arrived, Sigmund was ready. He dragged her into her car at gunpoint, his plan to drive her away to North Carolina. But Rebecca wasn't going to let him win. In a desperate bid for freedom, she managed to escape from the car and run. Sigmund chased after her, firing shots as she fled, but somehow she managed to slip away, running for her life. Rebecca was later treated for her injuries at Greenville Memorial Hospital, and Sigmund disappeared. However, his escape didn't last long. Once news of the brutal murders spread, a nationwide manhunt was launched. Law enforcement agencies were on high alert, desperate to bring the killer to justice. Sigmund, who had already been living on the edge, now found himself the target of a massive search. He was on the run for 11 days before authorities finally tracked him down. On May 8th, Sigmund was arrested in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, after being located in a rundown motel. The authorities didn't waste any time. He was quickly extradited back to South Carolina, where he faced the charges of double murder, kidnapping, and assault. Sigmund's trial began in 2002, and the details of his crimes shocked everyone in the courtroom. He admitted to the murders, leaving the jury with little doubt about his guilt. The prosecution made it clear that this wasn't just a case of a tragic crime. It was a horrific, brutal act that deserved the death penalty. David and Gladys Lark had endured unimaginable suffering, and Sigmund's actions were calculated and cold. But Sigmund's defense tried to paint a different picture. They argued that his troubled past, his drug addiction, mental health struggles, and failed relationships had pushed him to this point. They asked the jury to consider a life sentence instead of death, emphasizing his good behavior in prison and his past struggles. But in the end, the jury wasn't swayed. On July 20, 2002, Sigmund was sentenced to death for both counts of murder, as well as an additional 30 years for the burglary charge. Sigmund didn't go down without a fight. Over the years, he filed appeal after appeal, hoping for a reprieve from his death sentence. The South Carolina Supreme Court rejected his direct appeal in 2005. His second appeal was turned down in 2013, and federal courts dismissed his cases as well. Despite all of his efforts, Sigmund's fate was sealed. His final hope was dashed on January 11th in the year 2021, when the U.S. Supreme Court denied his last-ditch appeal. Then came March 7th of 2025, the day Brad Sigmund's life came to a violent, brutal end at the hands of the firing squad. At 6:05 p.m., inside the Broad River Correctional Institution, Sigmund was strapped to a chair with a hood over his head, the target over his chest, and just moments from his final breath. He had spent years on death row after taking 2 lives in cold blood, and now he was about to pay the ultimate price. The firing squad had volunteer prison employees who aimed their rifles. In a heartbeat, Sigmund's life was over. But what happened in those few seconds after the shots rang out is what still lingers in the minds of those who witnessed it. Sigmund's body flexed, arms jerking and chest rising, before he fell motionless. It was over, but only after a brief, unsettling struggle. He was pronounced dead at 6:00 p.m. And here's where it gets even more chilling. The execution wasn't just a technical formality. Journalists, including Jeffrey Collins from AP News, who was there to witness it all, reported that there was no countdown, no warning. The firing squad opened fire without so much as a glance at the clock. Sigmund, despite his restraints, seemed to mouth, "I'm okay," to his lawyer just moments before his body jerked and went still. Before all this, though, Sigmund had one last request: a meal. Seems simple enough, right? But for someone about to face death, maybe this was a small, fleeting taste of the life they were about to lose. Sigmund's final meal was fried chicken from KFC. Green beans, mashed potatoes with gravy, biscuits, cheesecake, and sweet tea. Not exactly the kind of meal you'd expect from a man about to be executed. But that's the thing about final meals. They're the last bit of normalcy a person gets before everything changes. And Sigmund even tried to share it. Originally asking for 3 buckets of chicken, he hoped to split it with other inmates, but whether he got his wish remains unclear. Aaron Gunches. Sometimes the darkest stories come from the most unexpected places. The story of Aaron Gunches is one of those. It's not every day you hear about a man who not only commits a brutal murder, but then spends the rest of his life pushing for the death penalty. His case isn't just about crime. It's about the life of a boy that started with violence, desperation, and an eerie desire for an end he believed was coming for him. Aaron Gunches didn't have an easy life. Growing up in a broken home, seeing anger and frustration, he didn't find the right ways to cope. As he grew older, his life began to go down a spiral. Relationships, addiction, and violent outbursts became a pattern he couldn't break. But it was one fateful night that set the stage for the crime that would define his life. On November 14 of 2002, Aaron Gunches was visiting his girlfriend, Catherine Letcher, in Mesa, Arizona. But things quickly took a dark turn when Catherine's ex-husband, Ted Price, showed up unexpectedly. What started as a simple argument escalated into violence, and in the heat of the moment, Gunches shot Ted. It didn't stop there. After the shooting, Gunches and Catherine, along with others, decided to drive Price out to the desert, where Gunches shot him 4 more times, leaving him to die in the middle of nowhere. The coldness of the crime sent shockwaves through the community. It wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a calculated, brutal murder. As if that wasn't enough, Gunches didn't slow down. A few months later, in January of 2003, he found himself once again involved in a violent crime. During a traffic stop, he shot at an officer, Robert Flannery, twice before fleeing. A full manhunt followed, and after hours of searching, Gunches was found hiding in a haystack, where he was captured and arrested. This marked the beginning of his fight with the justice system. By 2004, Aaron Gunches was in prison, facing serious charges for his crimes. He pleaded guilty to the murder of Ted Price and was soon sentenced to death. But here's where things get strange. Gunches didn't want to escape his sentence. In fact, he seemed to want the opposite. He didn't want life imprisonment. He didn't want to fight for his life. Gunches had made up his mind. He wanted to die. As the years went on, Gunches repeatedly waived his appeals. He asked the courts to speed up the process and end his life. He made it clear that he didn't believe he should live, saying that the Old Testament's eye for an eye principle justified his death. It was a strange and disturbing request, but he didn't back down. Finally, in the year 2025, Gunches got his wish. In March 19, after over 2 decades on death row, Aaron Gunches was executed by lethal injection at the Arizona State Prison in Florence. He had spent years trying to get the state to carry out the death sentence he had sought so desperately, and in the end, that's exactly what happened. For his last meal, he requested a bowl of vanilla ice cream. It wasn't a grand feast, but perhaps it was his final way of embracing a simple, fleeting moment of peace before the end. When it came to his final words, Gunches didn't hold back. In a stark and chilling statement, he said, "I don't feel bad for what I did. I'm ready to die." His words were cold, showing no remorse for the murder of Ted Price. Gunches didn't show fear as he was strapped to the gurney, and he was pronounced dead at sharp 10:33 a.m. His long journey of violence, guilt, and a longing for death had come to an end. After hearing these stories, it's hard not to wonder, what drives someone to commit such horrific acts? And when they face their end, do they ever truly reckon with the weight of their actions? Or is it just a final escape from their inner torment? If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you for watching.